So hi everyone. Welcome to the January 27th APAC community call. And so today, as we discussed last time, we'll actually do a little bit of a different style for the community call. We are going to have a CDM workshop with Claire here to answer all of the questions you may have already put in the forms from last community call. So first of all, I would like to thank you all for attending, and especially we have Claire here. So Tanya, if you go to the next slide. All right, so we have Claire here, who is Associate Director of Observational Health Data Analytics Group in Ensign R&D, and we have so glad to have her here to talk us about your CDM questions and also kind of the recent updates for the 5.4. So without further ado, so Claire, would you like to take the presentation or?
Absolutely, yeah. So yeah, keep the slides up that you have. I think we just have a running list of questions here. I just want to say thank you so much for letting me come here today and start off our year of CDM workshops. So I'm sure Mui shared with you, but it is our goal within the CDM working group to have a workshop every month. That's my stretch goal. And I want to do one every quarter in our major time zones, or according to your meridian, as Mark likes to say. So I wanted to start off with you guys because I think you guys are exploding so rapidly in the Asia Pacific region, and you have so many new data partners coming on so quickly that I wanted to make sure that you guys feel supported and that you have your questions answered, and that we are really happy to have you and excited to have you in the OHDSI community. And you're bringing such a rich amount of data to the community, and we really want to start incorporating your data into our network research studies. And so to do that, we want to make sure that you're getting into the CDM, getting your data into the CDM, and that any bumps or issues you have along the way, that we can help you through that. And then we also just want to learn from you and learn what you're seeing in your data that's different than what we have in the data that's already in the network, so we can just make the model better and our vocabularies better. Okay, so go ahead to the next slide. Okay, so this is just the number of folks who said that they were interested, and we had some interest in ETL conventions, ETL programming, and data quality, which is all very exciting. So let's go ahead to the next slide. All right, so what I tried to do, I do have some notes that I'll share. I'll probably send them to Mui tomorrow. I just want to polish them a little bit before I send them. But I took all the questions that you guys had, and I went through them, and some I might need a little bit more clarification. So hopefully the person who asked the question will be on the call. So I'm just going to dive right in, and really what I'm going to do is kind of walk through your questions, but please feel free to either chime in verbally or in the chat. I actually can't see the chat even though I'm in the OHDSI tenant, which is weird. So if someone could man the chat for me, that would be great. I'm just now realizing I can't see it.
No problem.
Okay, awesome. Thank you.
Chats.
Perfect. Okay. So yes, I'm just going to go on and get started, and then please just call it out, and I'd like it to be a discussion, but I'm really happy we have the questions to get started with. So the first question, what are the updates and challenges so far? So I took this to mean what are the updates and challenges related to the common data model itself. So of course we do have the recent release of CDM version 5.4, and we are asking the community to move to version 5.4 within this year, just because we want to make sure that we're all on the latest version of the CDM, because we believe it is the latest and greatest. And we did work really hard last year to add the oncology extension. I actually know that there's a question about that later on. And we fixed some minor issues that we had. And so we really are happy with the version as it is now. So that's the latest update. And challenges so far, there actually been quite a few challenges. And Mark and George and Mui and Nicole, please jump in as well if you have some things to add. But the challenges I've seen is that we actually kind of had to learn on the fly, or as we were going, in how to manage the versions of the common data model and what it really meant. And now as we have such a large community with you guys here in the Asia Pacific region, we have a really large contingent in Europe, and we've got a Latin America chapter starting and an Africa chapter starting, that any changes we make to the model actually has really far-reaching consequences. And so we have to be extremely picky, and we have to make sure that any changes we make, we try to take it out to the next step as far as it goes, so that we're not putting too much of a burden on the community. And so that has definitely been a learning curve as we've gone, but that's why we're on version 5.4, and I actually think we've done a pretty good job with it. Okay, next one, tips for ETL conventions or personal hints. I love this question. So my tip for ETL convention is to keep it simple. I started doing ETLs about 7 years ago, and I would add a ton of like crazy logic. So I'd say, oh, take a record from here and link it over to the procedure table and the cost table, and we're going to do this crazy stuff. And I was really proud of the complicated logic I put together. And now 7 years later, I'm revisiting them going, oh my God, no one would know how to use this for a research question. No one would know how to get this data back out because of the intense logic that I put in. So what I've actually been doing is keeping it as simple as possible, and really just writing, one record in my native data corresponds to one record in my CDM as much as possible. Of course, that's not always feasible, but I try to keep it as simple as possible, because then it'll be that much more simple to use it for research. So try to stay away from embedding too much kind of complicating factors into it, and just kind of go simple, and then kind of build from there. So yeah, and again, let me know if there's anything in the chat. Okay, number 3, where to start learning about the ETL. So we do have a chapter in the Book of Odyssey. So that's a really good place to start. And we have a course on the Eden Academy. So the links I'm going to send you and the notes I'm going to send you will have these links I'm referencing. So yeah, I would say kind of start there and just learn about first the model itself, and then start to dive into what ETL means, and kind of learn about how, what's the best way to get data from the native into the common data model. All right, question 4. What kind of level of statistical or programming skills are required for the CDM? So I'm hoping that the person who asked this question is on the call. So I was unclear if this was related to ETL. So if it's the programming skills required to write an ETL, or if it's the programming skills required to participate in network research or to write your own study package. Because I think they're different answers depending on how you approach this question. So if that person's not on the call, that's okay. But I'll kind of go through the different scenarios. And again, other Odyssey faculty, please jump in. So if you are writing an ETL, so you are starting to go from your native data to your CDM, you really need to have very good skills in relation to the database management system you're working with. Typically, it's some sort of SQL. So many of us house our data on some sort of SQL server somewhere. I have mine in the Amazon cloud. I know we have other collaborators who use Google BigQuery or Spark or Snowflake, whatever it may be. But you want to make sure that you have very good skills in relation to your database management system. And if you're kind of thinking about, okay, if I want to run a network study, you should have some sort of like base R skills, I would say. So if you're going to take, say, Mark has a study package and he says, I want you guys to run the Legend Diabetes study. You have to have the R skills in order to connect to your database and then run the network study. But you don't necessarily have to have like the intense R skills to actually build that study package. Because if you wanted to build a study package, you probably need very good R skills and SQL skills and maybe a little bit of a couple other things, but definitely R and SQL to build a network study package.
So Claire, I do have one question, not from the chat, from myself.
Oh, great.
There are different, people could be using Redshift, they could be using Azure, like whatever SQL environment or cloud environment to do their ETL. But then we do have, like you mentioned, Snowflake, which is really a rising for people to use. And then we do have, and then some of the China, data partners we work with, especially kind of, obviously I'm in China, so there are some people they will use like Hive, or a more different softwares, and then that really kind of come into the problem of the compatibility of, like, let's say our data quality dashboard, it currently not supporting Snowflake, or Hive, or even Alice is now supporting. I know not a lot of people are using Hive, or they are not the super common ones, but just kind of want to ask the question of like Snowflake or other like rising softwares people are using. Do we have a plan of kind of incorporating them, make them compatible with the existing Odyssey tools?
Yeah, so that's a super good question. So just to kind of give you a little bit of background, the way a lot of our packages run, I'm testing, the data quality dashboard, and some of our other main packages. Oh yeah, Mui, do you want to jump in?
Yeah, so technology is always new, right? There's always going to be new software development packages or new query packages that are around, right? And it will ultimately get in, but it really requires the community themselves to help. So, like, for example, Hive uses Impala, and which in the back uses Spark, and Scala. And I think a couple years ago that was brought up, and Atlas now does support Spark and Scala. Like you mentioned, Snowflake is something that's new and technology that a lot of people are playing with. So actually, Odyssey has teamed up with Snowflake and looking at and asked Snowflake if they have an interest to invest in helping out improve their tools to include Snowflake in the technology stack. And right now, that is something that they're doing. It's not done yet, but it's something that's coming up. Right. So, like you said, what kind of skills and programming languages are required to convert over to the CDM? It really depends on what software or what programming technology your company uses. Most people do use SQL, but I know plenty of people who use Python as well. I also know people who use Spark Scala. I know people who also use ETL tools. They don't actually, like Informatica and Sagent or Talent, they don't actually require ETL coding languages. So all that really depends on what your organization uses. But SQL is the simplest and the easiest to learn of all of them.
Yeah, and I would say our packages right now kind of assume that your data sits in some sort of SQL environment. So there's this kind of like underlying supporting package that takes one version of SQL and translates it to all the other versions of SQL that we support. So as Mui said, like we just added support for Spark because there was one particular company who is using Spark who also wanted to use Odyssey tools. And so they wrote the translation from the generic SQL that we use to Spark SQL. And so I don't know, Mui, if the same thing's happening with Snowflake, but I assume it's something pretty similar.
Yeah, it is. I mean, Snowflake is just, if underlying is really SQL, honestly, you can use SQL with Snowflake. It's just a few syntax are different, but yes, Snowflake is right now working with some of the companies to figure out how to, like you said, change the code, maybe underlying to just use SQL as well.
Yeah, but I would say pretty much our packages assume at this point that you were running in some sort of, yeah, it assumes the SQL environment. That's a great question. Okay, so I think we've gone through these ones. So can we move to the next slide? Okay, so this first question, I was hoping for a little bit of clarification. If anyone knows, so this question says how to build the CDM, any introduction about the CDM in mainland China. So I wasn't quite sure, where to go with this question. I don't know, Mui, if you had any thoughts about this one.
Yeah, so for those that are in China, we do have YouTube videos that we recorded as well as have out there on Odyssey that you guys can go look at that are in Chinese. We did some ETL ones, we did some CDM ones, and we did some, I think, patient prediction ones that throughout the year we've done in Chinese, not just in English, but in Chinese, that you can start looking at. So we can send those out as links when we're done after this call.
Okay, perfect, thank you. And so number 2, how to set an ETL on MacBook. So this is another one I'm hoping that the person who asked this question is on the call. I will give you a little bit of background on my personal setup. So I personally run off of a MacBook. I know, Mark, your whole lab runs on Mac. And so I actually find if you're working with R packages, I find that R packages run better on the Mac OS than in a Windows OS. But what I did for my personal use, I set up a Postgres instance. So it's a free open source interface that basically allows you to use your machine as like a SQL server, like a little SQL client. And then I put some synthetic data into that Postgres database so that I could test many of our Odyssey R packages just on this like small set of data. So if you are looking to use a MacBook, I think our packages actually run very well. And I have found a lot of success, running R and RStudio on a MacBook and then setting up just like a personal Postgres instance with some synthetic data. So when I send around some notes, like I can send out a link to the synthetic data that I use, and we actually have a full ETL package that would run, like if you have your little Postgres instance set up, it'll actually there's an R package that'll just run and take this synthetic data from its native form to the CDM. So it's a really nice introduction to ETL, and I have run it very successfully on my Mac. Okay, so number 3, are there any best practices for mapping pediatric survey questions? So this is a really interesting one, and I'm going to kind of like not stay specific to pediatrics, but just say survey questions in general. So you guys have probably seen we have a table in the CDM called the survey conduct table. Now this table goes back to that first question about challenges related to the CDM. This table was introduced by an OHDSI collaborator who was actually performing many surveys on their patients. And so the table itself is a little confusing because it's actually meant to record the time which a person is surveyed. So it's just meant to be the date and time and survey that a person took. And then the survey questions should actually go in the observation table. So what I typically do for surveys is I put the question and answer pairs in a record in the observation table. So what you can do is you can take the survey question and you can either find it in the existing vocabulary. There's actually a good set of survey questions, but I understand there are so many survey tools out there that most likely your questions you are asking will most likely not be in the vocabulary. So if that is the case, you can create your custom concepts if you would like to represent the survey questions you're using. So your custom concepts would be anything in the 2 billion range and above, meaning you need to start at the number 2 billion and work up. And so you can create your own custom concepts that you would put into your concept table to represent your survey questions. And then you can use the value as concept ID and value as string to hold the answer to that survey question. So you could put the string, obviously the string answer to the question in value as string. And then if you can find in the vocabulary a corresponding concept ID for that string answer, you can put that in value as concept ID. And if it's a tool that you use often and you have these standard, in this example, pediatric questions that you're asking, like I think back to when my son was, say 2 years old, and they ask all those questions about, is your child, walking on their whole foot and not on the balls of their feet, like all those kind of developmental questions that I would think this might relate to. You can create those concepts yourself and continually use them in your ETL. So I hope that answers the question. Yes, Mark.
Sorry, I have a little bit of a technical question, but this is something I've had in the back of my mind for a while. So custom concept IDs should start greater than 2 billion, but they should stay within 32 bits, right? Because the CDM specifies that most concept IDs will be just an int instead of a big int.
Yes, that is correct.
Okay.
Yeah, so I don't know the number that would get you over the 32-bit. Do you know what it would be?
Well, it's not that much. On a relative scale, it's not that much larger than 2 billion. So there are plenty of numbers between 2 billion and 2 to the 32.
Okay.
But many people hear you have to start greater than 2 billion, so they think, oh, I'll make it 4 billion or 5 billion, and that's way past 2 to the 32.
That's fair. I will say, in my personal ETLs, I do not use the 2 billion concepts, but it's only because I haven't had need for it. Though I do see the use and that they are very helpful. But that is a good point, and I will actually I'm going to put that note. I think we've chatted about this before too, like to make a note of this in the CDM documentation, that the 2 billion needs to stay between 2 billion and 2 to the 32.
Yeah, that's why I brought it up here, because there are some data sources online that have where this has caused some confusion.
Yeah, that's a good point.
I think we need to documentate that.
Yeah, and it's actually between 2 billion and 2 to the 31 because integers are in SQL are signed and we're not using any of the negatives. So, cool. Sorry for being really technical here, everyone.
No, that's perfect. Because I know we have kind of like listed it somewhere, but I don't know if we have a really great place that we've said you can use 2 billion concepts. We always just kind of throw out the number and say use a 2 billion, and don't really like clarify what that means. So that's very helpful. Mui, I think
there is a place. I think there is a place that documents all that in the vocabulary group. At least I know when we had a whole discussion about it, and it was all fully documented. So I have to go find where Themis is. But yeah, I know. For your like I use the 2 billion. Our group uses the 2 billions, and we start literally at the beginning of the 2 billion series. Like you said, Mark, so that we don't go all the way up. And I use it for a lot of reasons because we have a lot of different data sources where it's not covered, and we get a lot of text fields that are customized. So we then map them to standards. And that's where our 2 billions come in useful. But I do have to say that if you do end up using it, and I don't know, how many data assets you have or how many different types of domains you're going to end up using, but you may want to think about strategically, like Mark says, to go over the endpoint here, but also to reserve certain amounts for just one domain and another set for another domain. Because you constantly are going to keep adding. Like we constantly keep adding because everybody seems to like to type something different, the spell glucose, or to spell pregnancy. So we have to take all those into account and map them properly. And we've learned, sometimes when we don't keep a series just for drugs, then they get all over the place, unless you have a way to maintain them. Like we now have, if you're manually doing it, it may be helpful for you to just keep a set of them just for each domain.
And as Chan points out, you only have 147 million choices. So, but in spite of that, you will quickly fill those up if you don't space them properly.
I think Odyssey only has like 6 million. So yes, 147 million is not enough.
Okay, so I think what I'm going to do is I'm going to bug the vocab team, and I'm going to add an article under conventions on the website, because I think that's the right place to put it. And so be on the lookout for that, and I'll make sure I circle back. Okay, so the next question says, I'm curious about your opinion on encryption when extracting CDM. There's a limit to the utilization of the loaded CDM data. So I am hoping the author of this question can keep me honest.
So the question, the person who asked the question is Suho Park. I don't know if he or she is on the call now. Claire, if you need any.
Yeah, so I took this to mean how are we making sure the data are used appropriately, as in we are aligning with the data use agreements when we are utilizing data from the network in a study. And that's how I interpret it. I hope I interpret that correctly. So number one on encryption. So I think, Mark, correct me if I'm wrong, but when we do send results from a network study to a central location, we have an encryption key, if that's correct. Like, so the data itself aren't encrypted, but there is an encrypted key to make sure that it's not going all over the place.
The data themselves are not encrypted. So if there's a person in the middle, that can certainly be taken. But there is a key, a lock and key system for access to those artifacts. In the future, we should think about what type of encryption do we want to put on the individual artifacts themselves. However, they contain no patient level information. Well, let me correct that. They should contain no patient level information. So if you are developing packages, please don't hide patient level information in there.
Yeah, so the point of the OHDSI network being a federated network is that you keep all of your patient level information behind your firewall, and the only thing we are asking you for are aggregated results. Now, that being said, there are, of course, rules around usage of data that differ from data source to data source. So when you participate in a network research study, typically what we will do is go data source by data source, and each data source in a network study has a named owner. And that named owner is responsible for making sure that all rules are followed for that specific data source. So for example, I license a Japanese data set. And for that data set, I do send them a notice before we publish any results of theirs in a study. And so I send them a notice and I say, this is a study we're performing. Do you agree? Do I have sign off? And they will sign off on it. And then I have a UK data asset where I actually have to get approval prior to even running the study that I can run the study and include the results in a network research in a network research study. So there's different, obviously, like rules associated, but we do try to make sure that we are following all rules, and it is the job of the named data owner to follow up and make sure that we are handling each data asset appropriately. Yes, Millie.
Yeah, so I mean, we have similar rules. Like we have what we call the rule of small numbers. If your results come out to be smaller and the potential of being re-identified, then we actually have to roll up the aggregation even higher than what your study is asking for. But if your question here, because same thing with you, Claire, I don't know how to interpret this question, is if it's about actually extracting row level data out of the CDM, and if there's any encryption to that, that's really up to your organization. Like with us, we do have encryptions around certain elements, but not the entire CDM, right? So like we have an encryption around our patient ID, but again, that's a algorithm that we have internally that we apply, or like your provider ID. We also, in the US, the MPI number, there's an encryption around there as well. But again, that's something we, as in our company, has a rule to encrypt that. I don't, in the OHDSI world, there is no one standard rule that says you have to encrypt certain things a certain way. It's really up to your organization and how they treat their data.
Yeah, that was a great question. I'm hoping we answered. Okay, so on to the next one. It says the tech for OMOP and how to perform data mapping. So I, again, wasn't quite sure if this person was asking about the tech underlying the data itself, or the tech stack related to the web API and some of our tools like Atlas, or the tools we use for a study, because these do differ quite a bit. But because it says how to perform data mapping, I was assuming it's related to the tech related to, how to store your database and maybe technology related to data mapping. So yeah, Mui, do you have something?
I was thinking that this may be what are the technology and technology platforms that one can use to do a actual conversion.
Mm-hmm.
That's what I think this question may be.
Okay, so it sounds like you know a little bit more of those possible tools. So I can answer it from the Janssen standpoint and from some of the other folks I know. And then if you want to jump in, that would be great.
Sure.
Of course, I work for Janssen Research and Development, which is the pharmaceutical company of Johnson & Johnson. So we have a pretty good infrastructure underlying our databases. For the most part, we sometimes still have to twist an arm to get additional clusters stood up. But like I mentioned before, we use the Amazon cloud. So I use Redshift, and we have a functionality called Lambda, which is it's essentially, now I do not have a computer science degree. So the way I understand it, it's like a way to do serverless data mapping. It's hard. I have a hard time explaining it because I don't quite follow all the pieces, but it is an AWS Lambda functionality. It essentially allows you to use text files as if they were a SQL database. So it actually goes through the data mapping very quickly. But I work with an offshore team to help us do that. And this is specific to my company and what we need. So what I was going to say here is a lot of times the tech for your data and your mapping is really going to be related to how big your database is, and really how fast you want the mapping to go. But I don't know, Mui, you might have a little bit more breadth of knowledge in this space.
Yeah, so basically, like the whole serverless thing, it is more of everything's in memory and it processes it up in the cloud. It's very similar to like MongoDB, which does it by document and has a unique way of finding things a lot faster that are in a file versus it having a relational connection. But if you're looking at like technology, like Claire says, it's really what your organization has. But if you're looking for something outside of your organization, you could look at free tools like Talend, Talend, I believe that's how I spell it. It's an ETL conversion tool that is free that you can use. Behind it can be any SQL database that's tied so that you don't have to have a SQL person, a developer, to do the work, right? Most of us do have SQL developers or programmers behind us who does the work. So like I mentioned, I know of people who use Python to do the coding. I know people who use R to do the ETL. We use SQL itself in AWS. I also have a group that uses Spark in the backend to do the ETL as well. And then there are tools, enterprise tools, but they're quite expensive, like Sagent and Informatica, if you really want to purchase those, but they're quite expensive. I've actually also had somebody tell me they use SAS, not just R, but SAS to do the ETL programming. So it really depends on your company's technology. But if you're looking for some free stuff, I would start with one, the Odyssey tools, which helps you do some of the profiling, like White Rabbit, and then Rabbit and Hat that says the ETL document. But to do the actual ETL, I would suggest you find things like Talent. Actually, I know there's a group out there called CoConnect that actually has a free version that helps convert OMOP over, but it creates Python code in the back. So it's literally spelled co and then connect. But I don't know how free and how well it works. I just know of them because they were in the in one of the Odyssey showcases. I could put all those names in the chat just so that people know.
Thank you, Maria.
And I memorize all them.
And I took some notes, so those are going to be in my document I'll share tomorrow. Okay, so the next question is, how do you ensure data quality during the ETL process? This is a really good question, and it's something I deal with quite a bit, and I know it's something that Mui did deal with quite a bit before her new role. So I think the ETL process, it is a constant cycle. It's never done, but please don't get discouraged. It gets easier, but you're always going to be looking for data quality issues and making sure that your ETL is functioning as you think it should be functioning, as you continue to add data into your CDM instance, like into your CDM database. But I would say when you're starting out with your ETL, there are some simple things you can do to evaluate the quality of your native data. So some of the first things I do is I look for people who have records prior to their birth year. And then I also look for people who maybe have 2 birth years or 2 genders. So the CDM, of course, is a person-centric model. So whenever I start an ETL, I always start with the person table, and I'll start with these very simple data quality checks just to see where my native data falls. If there's a lot of issues with the persons and their birth years and their genders, or if there's few, it kind of gives me an idea of what I'm going to find as I go through the process. The other thing I do is I'll typically, as I'm walking through and I'm starting to map, as Mui said, we have the rabbit in a hat tool. And in that tool, it allows you to draw a line from, a field in your native data over to where that field's going to go in the CDM. And what it'll do, it'll actually show you the frequency of values in those columns as you're starting to build that visual mapping from your native to your CDM. And I find that just doing some simple frequencies on those columns really gives you a good understanding of what data is in there. And then you'll start to see some odd things happening. And I'm sure many of you have already seen that as if you're data owners or if you've been working on an ETL, you would expect maybe there should be only numbers in a field and you start to see weird characters. And that happens to me quite a bit. So when I'm starting an ETL, that's how I kind of go about it. I'll start with high level person-related data quality checks, and then I'll go into the fields that I'm going to map, and I'll start to look at the frequencies of values in those fields just to get an understanding of if the values in the fields don't align with what I expect to be there. And then once you have a good first version of your ETL, of course, you guys know I'm going to say you should run the data quality dashboard. And I usually, what I like to do is start with the conformance and the completeness checks, and then kind of save plausibility for later. Because if you are assessing your ETL, the conformance and completeness checks will really help you do that. So those are going to help you assess whether or not you've performed the mapping properly, if you have all your data in the proper domain table. So do you have all your condition records in the condition occurrence table? Do you have all your drug records in the drug exposure table? That kind of thing. And then it'll also assess the completeness of your mapping. So how many source values have you been able to map to a standard concept? So it'll give you a really good idea of where you are with your ETL. And then as you get farther down the line, you can add in those plausibility checks, which will give you some of those like date plausibility checks. Are your visit end dates after your visit start dates, that kind of thing. And then also your measurement plausibility check. So that's usually how I walk through that. Kind of, it's always a stepwise process. Okay. How am I doing on the chat? Any questions in there, or are we good?
We're good. So
Okay.
we have shared the links, and I think that would be very helpful. So thank you, Mui and Chen, for sharing the links.
Awesome, thank you. Okay, so this next one, I wasn't quite sure. So can I explain more about the ETL conventions as well as relevant programming tools we can use for research? So I'm just going to go a little high level on the ETL conventions. So when you go to the Common Data Model website and you click on CDM version 5.4, as you scroll down, you'll see every table. It lists the description, the user guide, and the conventions. And then we also have conventions for almost every field in the CDM. So what the conventions are trying to get at is they're trying to explain, for a table, it's trying to explain what kind of data should be included in that table, because of course you might not have a person table in your database. So what does the person table in the CDM, what is it supposed to contain, and what is it supposed to look like? So for example, in the OMOP CDM, each person should only have one record in the person table. But
hey, Claire, I apologize. Can we even pull it up so that we can see? I don't know, Jing, I think
sure.
you're sharing. Can we pull it up so that folks, there.
I was looking at it so I could reference what we were talking about
here. Then it may be easier for folks to follow.
Absolutely. Yeah, so here it says in the ETL convention, so I'm at odyssey.github.io/common data model, and I went to CDM versions 5.4 and I clicked here. So you'll see you've got the description, the user guide, and the conventions under the table, and then user guide and conventions on every field in the table. And so really what the conventions are trying to do is explain how you should treat data in this table. So like I was saying, in the person table, you should only have one record per person. But I have seen databases that have multiple records per person, because sometimes a person might get a record for every month they exist in a database. I have a native database that does that. And so I have to, when I write my ETL, I have to condense it down so that I only have one record per person, because the OMOP CDM specifies that I should only have one record per person. And so it's really these ETL conventions that make up the standardized structure of our data. So the tables and fields, it's really great if you have all the same tables and fields, but if you're not following the same rules for how you should get your data from the native to the CDM, then we're still not being standardized. So that's what we're trying to get to, is that we're all following the same rules, and we call them conventions, but they're essentially rules for how your data should be represented in the CDM. So I'll give you a couple more examples here. So let's see, I'm going to find a good one. Okay, so here we go. In the person table, we've got our fields here, and then I've got a column that says required. So if you scroll on down, you'll see the year of birth is required. Month of birth is not, day of birth is not, and birth date time. So you might have a baby in your database and you know the exact date and time that that baby was born. And so we say it's not required, but highly encouraged. And so there's a lot of text here that describes how you might infer the date of birth or the date time of birth, and how you might combine together the month, day, and year to get the actual birth date. And so it's just kind of trying to guide you into how to get your data from the native to the CDM and the rules that we expect everyone is following, so that we're all standardized to the same structure, and we're all standardized in terms of our content. Yes, Mui.
Hey, I get this question a lot. If I think about like common issues we have in Asia Pacific, and it's on the domain of, it's on the type concept domain, right? Especially like that we don't understand. I get a lot of times when they don't understand what it's used for, as well as what are the acceptable list of concept IDs to use for the type concept. Specifically, for example, drugs, right? When I've had a lot of people like come and tell me when they see this term in there called the drug concept type, we think of herbal versus Western medicine, right? So, and then I have to tell them that's not exactly how it works. So can you show the ETL convention like for the drug concept type ID so that people can kind of understand where to get the list of approved ones?
Yes, that's a really good point. So where it is available, so where we have a concept ID field, we have tried to link to acceptable concepts that should or could be included in that field. So in the case of a drug type concept ID, what we're really trying to understand is, where is the record coming from? Because it could be a physician is prescribing a drug to you, but I don't know if you actually picked it up from the pharmacy or if you even took the drug. So that would be a prescription written. It could be that I'm getting the drug record from a pharmacy where I know a patient went to a pharmacy and actually received the bottle of pills in their hand. And so in that case, I would use prescriptions dispensed. It's also possible that a patient's seeing their general practitioner and they say, oh, I've been on a statin for 20 years. And so we would call that medication history because the person is reporting themselves the drugs that they are currently taking. And there's also patient reported in a couple different things here. So we're really trying to understand is, where is this record coming from? How did you get this drug record saying that this person was exposed to this particular ingredient? And so when you go to this table here on the website, you'll see I actually have a list of accepted concepts. So if you click that, hopefully it works, it does. It'll take you to the type concept list in Athena. So these are all the possible type concepts you could use. And these type concepts work across all domains. So they are not domain specific, which is why you see here there are some things not related to drugs when you click on that link, but there are other things that are related to drugs. So for example, if you know that the drug record you're looking at is a record of a patient being administered the drug in the hospital. So the patient went to the hospital and got maybe an injection of a biologic. I could say, oh, this patient was administered this drug in the hospital, and I have this record in their electronic health record. So EHR stands for electronic health record. And so I would use this type concept here. So that's really what we're trying to understand is, where does this come from? You'll also see the word provenance used quite frequently to describe this idea. Just really, where is it coming from? Does that help? So that's a really good point, Louis, because the word type doesn't always get to what we're trying to denote with this field.
Yeah. I think Mark, you had your hand up earlier too.
Oh, I just put it in the chat. Actually, going through this table reminded me that when we calculate ages in most of the OHDSI tools, and all you have is a birth year, we assume people's birth date is on June 15th.
Yes.
Likewise, in terms of death, if all we have is a death year, we assumed it happened on New Year's Eve.
Yes, that's true.
So I was proposing that those two dates should be holidays.
Okay, so we have 3 minutes left. I'm trying to see, do we have time to answer maybe one more question? I'm looking at my list here.
There's someone raised their hand.
Oh, great. Yes, Ezra.
Yeah, hi. Sorry, I don't want to take away from a pre-submitted question since I didn't
No,
do that.
Go right ahead.
I had 2 people raising their hand. No, this is great. Ask.
Perfect.
Okay. I'm just wondering if you would be able to comment on is there a kind of convention in terms of how frequently people refresh their data model or update their data model, or does that differ, or do just based on organization, or do researchers or users kind of find that they like their data to stay static for a little while they're doing analyses, or and I guess the flip side, second part of that question, sorry, is because you mentioned kind of the accepted model is for the data to kind of flow out of a relational database, but I'm wondering if you can comment on whether you've seen any uptick of kind of real-time data in terms of flowing into the data model based on FHIR resources or something else. And yeah, just what you're kind of seeing out there from those two perspectives would be really helpful.
Yeah, great questions. Okay, so your first question about how often data are updated. It is usually dependent. Yeah, it varies pretty widely. So for me, I license all the data that I currently have access to. So my license it could be yearly. So we actually buy some databases from MUI every year. It could be every 6 months. I have some coming in every 3 months, and I have some coming in every 2 weeks. So I've seen kind of the gamut of refresh timings, and it really is dependent on what works best for you. I would say what I do, and I highly recommend, is to version your databases. Like you said, keeping something static for a study. So I work for Patrick Ryan, and I don't know if you guys know this about Patrick, but he is very interested in always having the latest data available as much as possible. So what we end up doing is we actually version our databases so that when you start a study, you know the version number that you use, so you continue to use that same version number throughout your study, even if there's a newer version of it available. And typically, I would say the refresh cycle is really dependent on your infrastructure and how many resources you can give to the ETL process, because it does take some time and resource and energy to make sure that the process is flowing smoothly and doing what you want it to do. So then to your second question about kind of using either like the immediacy of refreshes and maybe FHIR resources. So we do have quite a large group of folks in the OHDSI community that actually refresh their electronic health records either every night or every week. So they actually have data flowing directly out of their their hospital EHR system directly into an OMOP instance. And so that is happening much more frequently now, especially so in the United States. There was a big push to get a national COVID database. So that actually a lot of people actually started getting their hospital data into OMOP very quickly so they could get the money from being part of the national COVID database, which was really great because now we have this really large group of hospitals who have an infrastructure set up to do that. As far as FHIR, there is an active collaboration between OHDSI and FHIR. And I think George might have dropped off, but I think George and Christian Reich are both heading that up. And there is active work going on to understand how to get FHIR, I forget the term for it, but like FHIR, like data points into and mapped to, OMOP CDM fields.
Yep. Okay. Thanks very much. Really appreciate that.
Absolutely. Mary Kim.
Hello. So I'm from Korea, and our organization has this long list of drugs of interest, and we are trying to make this standardized mapping code book for the investigators. So what we are trying to do is map each drug of interest to concept ID in a clinical drug class. So most of them are okay, except we have a few gray areas, and we would like to hear your strategies or any tips. So there's this case where one product can be made into multiple concentrations depending on the patient. So in that case, how do you, and we are trying to map to one concept ID. So was there any case where you had to do that? Do you have any ideas?
So this is different concentrations by person.
Yes.
So would these be drugs that are given in the hospital, like an infusion drug? Or is it like based on the patient's weight that they get a different amount?
Yeah. One of them is growth hormone, so it's probably on maybe BMI.
Okay.
Or another example is dialysis solution. So there are a few of these cases.
Okay. So in that case, what I would probably do is that would actually be dependent on the person itself. So the drug amount that's being given, the drug ingredient doesn't change, but the amount given to the person might.
Yes.
So in that case, I would actually map that concentration as you are mapping individual person level data. So I would map the drug itself, I'm thinking here, probably to like a clinic, whatever the clinical drug form is. And Mui, I know you might have some experience here too, so jump in. But I would probably map it to like a clinical drug form, and then as you're mapping the actual data, that's where you would see that difference in concentration by person. So you could use like the drug strength to denote that.
So so if I'm making this standardized booklet for investigators, I would just decide the clinical drug form of that product, and I would decide the clinical drug class by study when they are starting a study.
I would actually think about it. No, you're good. I would actually think about it like at the ETL level. So yeah, so it would be like, because if you're talking about growth hormone and it's dependent on the person's weight, then what I would think is they might get the same drug ingredient, but the dosage is going to be different. Yes. So yeah, I would probably map whatever we like to say to map to the lowest level information that you have. So it might be either probably clinical drug form or the branded drug form if you have the brand. And then as you are writing your ETL, that dosage will change based on the person. And that's kind of where my brain's going, but yeah, I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, I
there.
thought there was a dosage table that we used to have, but let me, I'm going to take that back to ask the vocabulary team, because I know everybody runs into this every now and then. So let's see how they handle it. So I'll take that back.
Yeah, we have the drug strength table now, Millie.
Correct.
Yeah.
Yeah,
one
so
of the things,
it would be at the, because this would be then at the strength level. Right. So you would still, and that's a different concept ID overall. So then you would be in the ETL, when you're doing the ETL, you would be mapping it to that drug, but then at that strength.
I see.
Yeah.
Okay. So we will come back to that later, maybe. You will send us like.
We'll give you the answer by the next community call.
Okay.
How's that?
Oh, thank you.
You're welcome.
Bear with me with just one more question.
Sure.
So there's this case where so if I search in Athena, I get 2 candidate options for mapping, but one has more descriptive informatic descriptions. However, our product is not registered. Our brand name is not registered in this first option. The second option, it's less of information, but our brand name is registered. In that case, if our interest is only the clinical drug level, can we just choose option 1, even though it doesn't have our brand name registered?
Yeah, absolutely. So if the brand is not as important to you on the standard concept, that's totally fine. It's really just choose the standard concept that works best for you. You can also map your source concept ID if necessary to that branded drug if you are concerned about losing that granularity of the brand. And so you could potentially in your ETL map that source concept so you still have that information.
And then if you don't have the brand in the OHDSI community, one of the things you can do, especially in Korea, is put it in the forums, because then we can create what we call an RX norm extension for your brand name, which then maps it still all the way back up to the ingredient, because the hierarchy is there, right? So that's one method. Or the second method is what we talked about earlier, which is using the 2 billion series yourself, because then you can create a brand form, but then you have to add into the concept relationship tables the mapping back up to the ingredient, which is a little more difficult to do, but you can do it yourself. But my recommendation is, if you want the brand as a quote unquote standard for OHDSI, you can put it in the vocabulary forums and they will add it as what we consider an RX norm extension, which then you can download from OHDSI directly.
Just one last question. So how do you, so if I get 2 options, for example, I have this drug that is Viscot, it's ophthalmic solution, but its form is in pre-filled syringe, but you drop it in your eyes. So if I search it on Athena, I get 2 options. One is pre-filled syringe, another one is ophthalmic solution. So in such case, I think the second one is more appropriate because it seems like topical. So in these kind of situations, do we just, is it just our medical judgment?
Yes, yeah, it is. Okay. It is your medical judgment, and that's a really good question. So, one thing I will say too is, a lot of times when you are conducting a study, we are mostly concerned if the person is exposed to the drug ingredient at all. Now, where I find something like the route of administration, say ophthalmic or topical, or oral, where I find it to really make a difference, and where I've seen it make a difference is in steroids. So a lot of times a protocol wants to distinguish between systemic corticosteroids and exclude topical corticosteroids. So that's where in a use case I see, oh, I need to make sure that I map the topical version of this steroid because I want to make sure I'm excluding topical steroids when I'm looking for systemic steroids. So I would try to think through your use cases, and I think you're right. I would probably use the ophthalmic solution because that makes more sense because that's how the patient is getting the drug in their system. So that would make sense to me.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, very good questions. Absolutely.
Hey, Claire, I know we're 13 minutes over, and I apologize that this has gone over, but this has been a very interesting topic, especially towards the end here where we have folks asking questions. I do see one more person with their hands up. I don't know if you are okay with answering that one last question. But before we go there, I want to say thank you, Claire. And I know that we have not been able to get through all of our questions. So we are going to talk to Claire to see if she can come back for a secondary session in the next community call, just to finish answering all those questions. And if you guys have any more questions, we may change the format up a little to allow you guys to ask some questions live, because then I think it might get the discussion flowing a little bit more. But I think Nitesh, you can, if you're still here, feel free, ask your question.
Thanks, Claire, for sparing your time.
Sure, it's been great.
Just a short question. So I'm from Singapore and at Ministry of Health, we are trying to implement OMOP for our NEHR data. So a quick question. So what is the best way to map radiology data into OMOP?
That's a great question. We actually have a working group starting up to tackle that. So Dr. Paul Naji at Johns Hopkins is interested in this question as well. So he is starting up a radiology and imaging working group because we don't actually have a great standard to capture that data. So I would definitely recommend, if you are interested in that, definitely join that working group, because they are looking for participants and people who really know this data very well and can recommend potential standards for how to store it.
Sure. So right now, in OMOP standards, we don't have any particular way that how to implement it. At least
we don't, no. So what we tend to do in terms of the data model itself, we tend to work on a use case basis. So if we have a steady use case and we have a really good argument for the use of the data, then we will work to develop a solution for the, I call it the canonical CDM, but for the main model. And right now we are still working on just generating evidence at scale. So we haven't had a ton of use cases for radiologic data up to this point. But I do know that there are a lot of people who are interested in using it, and it's becoming much more common. And so while we don't have a great solution now, I'm hopeful we'll have one within the next year or so.
Thanks, Claire, for the answer.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for the question. That was great.
Yes, thank you. So again, I want to say thank you, Claire, for joining us. And thank you, everybody who submitted their questions. I know we didn't get enough time to go through all of them, but hopefully we've gone through enough of the questions where maybe you guys have an idea of what other questions you might have. Like I said, I will talk to Claire about whether or not she can join us for a second session to finish off some of the questions you guys have. But in the meantime, if you do have more questions, do let us know.
Yep, and I'll be sending some notes to Mui that she can disseminate to you guys just on like what we talked about today and the additional questions we had. And thank you guys for being my guinea pigs and starting off the year with our CDM workshop. So this has been fantastic. You guys have been great.
Thank you.
Very much.
All right.
Thank you,
It was really
everybody.
nice chatting
Have a
with you
nice
guys.
one.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.